What's up, everyone? Welcome to Bill Bronze and Dragons. I'm your host, Bill Bron Bafflestone. So today we're having another episode of my deep dive series. Today looking at the Reborn, one of the new lineages from Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, and while I personally find it the least impressive of the new lineages, it's still pretty decent and worthy of a deep dive. So let's jump right into this and take a look. So the first thing I wanted to mention is the flavor text, which isn't something that I usually talk about when it comes to races, but the flavor text of the Reborn and the appearance that is tied up with it is unusually significant and has a really strong impact on the role-playing considerations. And they're not the sort of thing that I personally feel comfortable reskinning because a lot of them have pretty negative connotations and drawbacks to them. So it's just something to consider and keep in mind during character creation, and I wanted to call it out. The next thing I want to call out are the stat bumps. You can get +1/+1/+1 on these new lineages, and that's pretty fantastic with point buy because you can start with 3 16s. And that's a really nice option for some of the more multi-attribute dependent builds. I've done a couple of Dampier builds lately that have the same stat bump array, and it's really pretty sweet, so definitely worthy of a call out here. Next, they get Ancestral Legacy. And if you start as a Reborn, you get 2 additional starting skills, and that's pretty good. However, this does offer the potential to just stack on a fly or a climb or a swim speed. And if it's a fly speed, that is pretty OP. I mean, the Reborn does offer some pretty good abilities, and if you add a fly speed on top of it, that's pretty crazy. I personally think that's overpowered, but some DMs are going to allow it, so, ask if you want. Now, this is obviously good for any flying race, but also the lizard folk and the tabaxi are interesting because both of them offer 2 skills and either a swim speed or a climb speed, so that's still really good. And maybe not so crazy as a fly speed. So your DM might allow those races, but not an Aarakocra or something. Next, the Reborn have the option of being small or medium, and they get 30-foot move regardless of which one they choose. It's great to get 30-foot move and small size combined, unlike many other small PC races. Being small means that you can ride a medium-sized mount, so that does have synergy with classes that have such options, like a Battlesmith or the Beastmaster. If you're small, you can definitely fit into a bag of holding. You might be able to do so if you're medium, but the DM might object if you're medium and say you're too big. Gonna have a much harder time making that argument if you're small. Being small means you can take squat nimbleness, which is a pretty good half feat that also imparts +5 move, either acrobatics or athletic skill, and advantage to grapple escape check. So that's a pretty strong feat to be able to add. Being small means that you're 1 step of size reduction away from being tiny size. And being tiny can be very cool. You can ride in the Paladin's backpack or whatever. Being small means that it's easier to find cover, not just dealing with the environment, but there are some things that affect a 5-foot cube that the PC might want to do, like Minor Illusion or Mold Earth. And if you're small, then those things will definitely provide more cover. Being small has no effect on your carrying capacity, so that's good. But it does come with 3 drawbacks. 1, you can't use heavy weapons if you're small, at least without a disadvantage penalty. You're an inferior grappler if you're small because you can only grapple things up to medium size. And you can't carry medium allies with you if you are using Dimension Door or Thunderstep. So those things may or may not matter, but it's nice to have the option of being small or medium for the build that you're trying to put together because you might get an advantage either way. The Reborn get knowledge from a past life. And this is all right. It's applied after the initial roll, which is always nice, and it can turn a failure into a success. However, the ability check roll must be tied to a skill, which is kind of lame because that means it won't apply to initiative, to dispel magic or counterspell checks, to dismount checks, to telekinesis checks, right? Any of those checks that aren't attached to a skill you can't use. It would have been so much better if it hadn't had this skill requirement, but it does. And at least you don't need proficiency in the skill. So this can give you a chance at some that you don't usually do too well. So the versatility of it is nice. And it does offer nice synergy with skill-heavy builds like, Rogue or Bard, or with builds that have other skill buff options. If you have Guidance or Side-Bolstered Knack or something, you can stack on Knowledge of a Past Life, and that can be good. And it is pretty solid for grappling builds. I mean, it's only a proficiency times per day, so it's not like you can do it all the time, but it can give you that occasional bump when you need it. And that can be important when you really need to stick a grapple, like if you're a mage hunter concept or a build, or even if you're just working in tandem with a colleague who's casting silence on a caster, and you're supposed to handle the grappling part and you really need to stick it, I would be very happy to assign that task to a Reborn. And even outside of that rather niche situation, albeit an important niche situation that everybody should have some plan C's or D's against, it will improve any build's defenses against being grappled and against most versions of restrained like web or those restrained conditions that are attached to a grapple like the T-Rex bite. So knowledge from a past life is pretty good. Not overwhelming or amazing, but a nice little Benny to add. Finally, the Reborn get Deathless nature, and this is the one that is going to call for the most discussion. So first of all, I can't complain about advantage to poison, disease, and death saves, or resistance to poison, or immunity to sleep. Those are all really good when they come up. Poison is one of the most commonly encountered damage types, so being resistant to that is going to be really good over the course of your career. Disease is not a huge factor in 5th edition. It's not going to come up too often, but it might against, say, a contagion, or if you're fighting Zutmoy or something. Again, one of those things that doesn't come up too often, but when it does, you will be pretty happy to have this. And I will say, advantage to death saves can be sneaky good. God forbid you ever go down and have to make death saves, but it does happen in 5th edition. And basically, this gives you a 75% chance to succeed versus a standard 50%, which means over the course of playing out your death saves, we have a chance of auto-stabilizing 90% of the time. That's actually pretty solid. Plus, we have about a 10% chance of getting that 20 that we need to immediately regain consciousness, and that's going to feel pretty good if you stick that. So I kind of like the advantage to death saves here. Not needing to sleep is good for standing watch, right? You can't move during those 4 hours, but if you have a familiar or homunculus or something, you can kind of circumvent that. And also being immune to sleep opens up some opportunities for casting it with ourselves in the area of effect. For example, when we only have 1 hit point remaining and are going to be like last in the queue for being affected. So that can also be nice in tier 1 if you can engineer that scenario. For the Reborn, cost of living is not a consideration. We don't need food or shelter, and that might matter at some point, maybe in the early levels when we're not that rich. You can combo Deathless Nature with Mold Earth and gain a safe short or long rest, much like a Meld into Stone or a personal tiny hut. You can also kind of tunnel indefinitely, just continuously move Earth so that you can move underground and then you don't have to worry about running out of air, and then maybe go underneath that fence or whatever. Not needing to breathe means that you can operate effectively underwater. It means also that you can survive inside of a bag of holding indefinitely instead of only 10 minutes, or a portable hole or whatever. And you can combine this with small size for a personal always-on rope trick. That can be pretty sweet. And you can have a summons like your familiar or homunculus fly it around, and you can use it to protect your concentration once you drop a really good one, so that can be a sneaky good combo. Now, the fact that you can accomplish a long rest in 4 hours is pretty good for crafters, so they can squeeze in more incremental crafting, and this can actually have a pretty strong game effect if we're talking about Arcana. Because if you have Arcana, then you can create scrolls, and scrolls can be awesome for optimizing your caster. Not only does it open up things like having scrolls of Misty Step so that you can't be silenced, but you can also create lots of cool utility scrolls that you wouldn't want to necessarily prep, but are good to have on hand, like Knock or Gust of Wind or something. So if I were playing a Reborn, I would definitely make sure I had Arcana if I was a caster. Okay, but the most important thing that we need to talk about with Deathless Nature is the fact that these 4-hour long rests may allow for superior rest tricking. It specifies with very clear verbiage that the Reborn long rest is only 4 hours, unlike Trance or Sentry's Rest, which rules as written or rules as intended don't actually reduce a long rest below 8 hours. It just increases your downtime hours within that 8 hours, but you still need 8 hours to complete a long rest with those. Not with Deathless Nature. It definitely specifies that you only need the 4 hours, which means, theoretically, you could add 4 additional short rests on top of that 4 hours that you need, because the rest of your party needs 8, And in that 4 hours, one can make the argument that you can conduct 4 consecutive short rests. Now, obviously, none of this happens without your DM's approval. It's his opinion that matters the most. I'm just pointing out, rules as written, there's no limit on the number of short rests that you can take. Now, the DM might easily think this is overpowered, and if so, Jeremy Crawford provides a perfectly valid interpretation by which a DM can nerf it. I've put on the screen a series of tweets where he basically emphasizes that, yeah, your DM gets to make that call. However, that doesn't impact the rules as written, and it seems like common sense to me that if you're actually casting spells at the end of each rest or converting spell slots or whatever, that does seem to be the sort of thing that would then allow you to instigate a short rest. Like, to me, if you go all out for 2 minutes or something, you're going to be like super tired, and at that point you're going to be like, okay, I need to take a rest. I feel like a DM would be pretty silly to be like, no, you can't rest, even though you just exhausted your spellcasting ability. But that's just me, and if your DM wants to nerf it, then he can. But if the DM does allow these additional short rests, which in my opinion he should, then certain classes can benefit, especially the Sorlock. Reborn Sorlocks can generate a lot of extra sorcery points by expending their Warlock slots and then getting them back after the short rest. And those sorcery points can be converted to Sorcerer spell slots, which last until the next long rest. There's no limit on the number that they can have, and they can even have slots that are above the slots that they can cast. So that's a pretty sweet interaction. And note that this is similar to what the Coffee Lock does, but it is not the same because the Coffee Lock implies you're skipping long rests. Here, we're not skipping any long rests, and so even if the DM is opposed to Coffee Locking, this seems like it's legal rules as written to me. And so I've listed a chart of how many sorcery points you can generate based on your level, and you can get up to 60. Probably more realistically, you're going to get like 16, but it can get crazy if you really choose to milk it. But even 16 is pretty good, right? So that's going to give a nice little bump to a Reborn Sorlock that if the DM goes for it, this to me is literally the only reason to go with Reborn. All the other stuff is cool, but this is like the killer app. And it's not just good for Sorlocks. If you're a Battle Master or a Martial Adept, you can use it to get lots of uses of Rally and confer a lot of temporary hit points. If you're an Alchemist Warlock, you can generate extra experimental elixirs because those are created with a first level slot. Druids can use their Wild Shape to get a Familiar, which lasts quite a long time, although not significantly long until you get to higher levels. Druid Warlocks can create oodles of good berries, or even life berries if you dip Life Cleric, and that can be pretty overpoweringly crazy. I mean, that's a lot of free good berries. Spore Druids can use Symbiotic Entity and get free temporary hit points, equal to their level times 4 per long rest. Clerics can use their Harness Divine Power and Rest Trick Channel Divinity, maybe throwing up an aid or something, although note that they get a limit to the number of uses of that per day. And Spirit Bards, once they get to 5th level and recharge their Bardic Inspiration on a short rest. Note that 2 of their tails do confer temporary hit points, number 3 and number 6, and tail number 6 is really good because it also confers +1 AC and move +10 for the duration of those temporary hit points, which again is all day. So that can be a very interesting combination, a Reborn Spirit Bard. So that's it. That's my take on the Reborn and my deep dive into their abilities. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Did I miss anything? Can you think of any cool ways to leverage the Reborn abilities that I missed? If so, I'd love to hear about it. Regardless, thank you so much for watching. This has been Bill Bronze and Dragons. I'm your host, Bill Bron Bafflestone. See you next time.